Hi everyone, this is the second in a series of 5 K-punk quarantine videos from a series that we did online earlier in the year. The whole purpose of them was to discuss and explore ideas and themes in relation to the work and legacy of contemporary cultural theorist Mark Fisher. So the series took place online. We recorded the sessions so that people could refer back to them if they wish to make notes or just to remember what it was that we spoke about. So this particular week's session is looking at eco-criticism, climate change and slow violence in relation to some of Mark Fisher's texts, in particular Capitalist Realism, as well as a chapter from Matt Colquhoun's recent publication Egress. Now, if you're interested in that book, or if you want to learn a bit more from Matt about his ideas on Fisher, we've got a really fantastic guest lecture as well that we recorded. So head over to our YouTube channel to find that, or alternatively see our website. It's got a full list of all resources on it, as well as more information about upcoming events and series and lots of free stuff basically. So go and help yourself. As I say, the audio for this particular session cuts out a bit at the beginning, so sorry for that. But just to essentially summarise these initial slides here. And just a quick note to say that this week we also had a special guest, Liam Knight from the Dystopias reading group at the University of Birmingham, to share some of his thoughts at the end of the presentation. So I hope you enjoy those too. This week's session on climate catastrophe and the world focused on 3 particular things. Capitalist realism as a form of slow violence, and how that plays out alongside the normalisation of crisis, which I really draw heavily on Fisher's text, Capitalist Realism, to explore. Secondly, Matt Colquhoun's chapter, Mental Health Asteroid, to explore the idea of embracing the fearful unknown in relation to climate catastrophe and the slow violence and unfolding of crisis. And finally, trying to answer the question, or opening up discussion to answer the question, is an alternative to capitalism possible, especially in relation to the political action or inaction, depending on how you look at it, of green consumerism and green activism. So, as I say, I'm not, and I'm by no means a Fisher expert. I use some of Fisher's texts and Matt's text here to open up discussion, mainly in relation to my own research, which is on slow violence of climate catastrophe in relation to contemporary American fiction. So if you have any questions, or if you'd like to talk any more about any of these ideas, please feel free to get in touch, or get in touch with the team to find out a bit more about how you can get involved with everything else we're doing. I hope you enjoy the rest of the slides. You can think here about some of the need for surveillance and the really frightening rise of things like facial recognition technology and the rolling out of those technologies. And we can also think here about what's happening at the moment with COVID-19 as well. Privacy, who owns our data, who's using it, who's accessing it? Is it being shared with private companies? We can think there maybe about some of the conversations around tracking and tracing. Okay, but there is a huge contrast, I would argue, between this normalisation of crisis as a mode of governance in the face of immediate threats to life posed by things such as pandemics, terrorism, natural disasters, and the catastrophic failure of the long-standing catastrophic failure of governments to protect us from the climate crisis that we are living through right now and have been for some time. This jumping from one crisis to the next is a very, very effective distraction technique. It manipulates us into focusing on the symptoms rather than actually addressing the root of the issue. And it works so effectively because it's banking on our short attention spans and our sense of powerlessness, right? Who's going to pay attention for long enough? Who's going to get angry enough about it to do something and get others to do something as well? And what is the alternative? It's a sense that we can't change anything, and it's too big for us even to imagine a different way of being, which kind of leads on to the crux here of the defining obstacle of capitalist realism, which Fisher kind of defines as such, as let me find it, which Fisher defines as it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, which he kind of adopts here from
Jameson and Zizek. So this claim that it's easier to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism kind of plays on this idea that it's only our current system which can protect us from world-ending crises. And we can no longer even imagine an alternative to it because, as Fisher puts it, capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizons of the thinkable. And this is an idea which he goes on to talk about and to explore in the using the example of the 2006 film Children Men. This is a dystopian movie. If you're not familiar with it, it's quite bleak. It's not like Sunday night viewing, probably, but I would recommend it if you haven't seen it. It's a fantastic film. But the basic premise is this: the year is 2027. Some unspecified catastrophe has happened. We don't know what, but it's caused mass infertility. So no new children are being born, and as a result, the world is sort of slowly unraveling. Okay, Fisher looks at this idea of mass infertility to kind of suggest that the film is posing the question of how long can a culture persist without the new. What happens if the young are no longer capable of producing surprises? Children of Men, Fisher writes, connects with the suspicion that the end has already come. The thought that it could well be the case that future harbours only reiteration and repermutation. So if we think about this, if there is no future, that it essentially means we're not able to imagine an alternative to the present. There is no change, and nothing changes at all. Now, this could be the case both figuratively and literally. Politics and culture become sterile when we regurgitate dead ideas, and the human race will inevitably be driven to extinction in this model because there's no future. And this is an idea that we continue to grapple with in the face of climate change. That's quite a heavy thought, and on that sort of cheerful note, I want to talk about this idea of endings here, or of sort of what disaster looks like. So the film itself, Fisher argues, plays out a disaster slowly. He says that there is no punctual moment of disaster, and the world doesn't end with a bang. It winks out, it unravels, it gradually falls apart. Crucially here, the catastrophe is being lived through. It's not in the past, it's not in the future. And I think this provides quite a useful and a powerful image when thinking particularly about climate catastrophe, because it plays into an idea that Rob Nixon speaks of in terms of slow violence, which is the idea of calamities such as climate breakdown, which are slow moving, and they're experienced as a form of long dying. And we often think of violence as a form of instantaneous spectacle, sort of a one-off event that, really kind of graphic imagery that's related to it. It's something really sudden and violent and uncontrollable happens, and often there's a sense that there's the life before that violent event and the life after that violent event. But instead, Nixon argues, and I think this is what Fisher is kind of picking up here as well, in this idea of the long dying, that this form of slow moving disaster is not single, it's not self-contained, it's not a single tipping or turning point in which everything changes, but it's something infinitely bigger than us. It's massively distributed in time and space. And Nixon argues, and I agree with him here, that this is one of the main reasons why we failed to date in tackling climate change, because it really requires thinking about and then actually overhauling this long-standing violence that's really built into the system. And this is something Fisher explores at length. So how can we even kind of comprehend the scale of this issue if it spans beyond our individual lifetimes? And I think this is really something that might be quite useful to think about and pick up it in our breakout sessions. But moving on from this, I want to kind of examine next what exactly has changed since Fisher wrote Capitalist Realism, and sort of re-evaluating that now, sort of 11 years on. So I think one of the big things that has changed since then is in terms of climate catastrophe, public discourse has massively changed. There's a lot more of it. The language around it has changed, even that significant shift from referring to it as global warming, which sounds quite pleasant and quite non-threatening, to climate change, which then again sounds like, oh, it's just, this is natural, this is what happens, to again like climate crisis, or even the more powerful use of the word extinction, as in we are living through the sixth mass extinction event. Not a very nice thought. But I also think that a lot of people now are more open to accepting that this is something we are living through now. It's something we are experiencing in real time, and it's unfolding slowly, rather than something that we are moving towards in the distant future, or something that future generations are going to have to tackle many, many years from now, and we won't have to worry about it because we'll all be dead. So Matt Colquhoun also picks up on this, and there's two things sort of he addresses here. So one is he's saying, yeah, things arguably have only gotten worse since Mark wrote this. And the main reason for this is it's a sense of this normalisation of crisis, not just in terms of counter-terrorism legislation, but also in these endemic mental health crises that are happening around the world. So even though there's a lot more discourse around mental health and climate crisis, for the most part, we're just acknowledging and normalising rather than actually tackling it. So when we allow crisis to become normalised, we're really not addressing the root cause at all. We're not addressing the system that produces these crises, and I want to kind of examine here why that is. Now, Fisher suggests that one of the main reasons is because capitalism consumes everything, even thought against it. And this is something that Niall touched on last week when he discussed some examples of meta commodities. So Fisher kind of describes capitalism as being very much like The Thing in the John Carpenter movie, a monstrous, infinitely plastic entity capable of metabolizing and absorbing anything with which it comes into contact. And I think one of the most powerful and perverse examples of this is the way in which capitalism, which is a fundamentally unsustainable and destructive model based on ever-increasing growth, safely consumes and contains and essentially neutralizes anti-capitalist rhetoric in the form of green consumerism and green activism. We're essentially told that the best way to combat climate change is through capitalism, by producing competitive markets for green technology. Leave it to us. This is what capitalism excels at. And I think there's a real destructive atomization of individuals at play here, which Fisher talks about quite extensively in his work. And that feeds, I think, in particular into both the climate and mental health crises, because the message is this: the most power you have as an individual is as a consumer. It's not as a voter, and it's certainly not as part of a political collective. And we can see evidence of this in the rampant growth of green and wellness industries. Take care of yourself and the planet by buying into a lifestyle. Like, that's a very comforting thought, but it's a complete illusion, right? Turn inward, heal yourself with meditation podcasts and yoga mats, or healing vaginal crystals. Yes, that's a real thing. Buy organic, buy eco-friendly, and feel good about yourself. Basically, ignore what you can't control, and most importantly, just keep buying. So I think Matt picks up on this quite frankly and quite beautifully, really, in Mental Health Asteroid, which is there is a real genuine need, I think, here to heal. And he does this by exploring an image of a mental health asteroid, which he adopts from Laura Penny's analogy. She coins the term when she's writing in the aftermath of Trump's election to kind of describe this weird paradoxical nature of suffering in the wake of disaster. And he goes on to describe it as an asteroid without a crater. It's a shockwave, felt but not seen, a horrific planetary event without the disaster movie spectacle and mass extinction it seemed to promise. So it's this idea of something horrific has happened, like everything has changed, but almost nothing has changed. Like, it's decimated our insides, but you know, the shell of the person is still there, and on the surface it almost appears as though nothing is wrong. For Penny, who coined the term, she's talking obviously about the implication of Trump's election, but for Matt, he talks quite frankly about not only what he refers to as this capitalist apocalypticism, that's a bit of a mouthful, but also the kind of the personal and communal grief that's really felt in the community at Goldsmiths and beyond in the wake of Mark's death in 2017. And I think that this image of the mental health asteroid is particularly useful because Matt talks about this, how it kind of evokes this this weird rationalism of science fictioning, which was admired, he writes, by Mark himself, for its ability to denaturalize our world, to make emotions impersonal and therefore more explicitly political. So this is something he goes on to explore, which is how do we use this technique, or what techniques can we use to imagine exits to our grim realities, to imagine these alternatives. So he explores the example of sort of zombie movies, zombie TV shows, Shaun of the Dead. He uses The Walking Dead in particular, and there's a monologue used by Rick where he's talking about how they're kind of trying to cope and survive, and kind of uses this idea of we are the walking dead, and it's the idea of living as though you too are dead, of kind of identifying with the deceased, with the other. And this is something we know through testimony. It's actually quite a common experience with soldiers who are surviving the trauma of war, but it's that embracing of the unknown that keeps them alive, that allows them to survive. And that's an element there of making the emotions, again, impersonal in order to do what needs to be done. But Matt, I think really rightly here, draws attention to the importance of the we in that statement. This is a communal experience because we are more powerful together. And he gives some more examples here of how these cultural explorations of the fearful unknown, of death, of extinction, and essentially of exit from our current grim reality can help us to imagine real exits from personal grief and this capitalist apocalypticism. Okay, so this fearful unknown, how do we embrace it and why should we embrace it? So as I said, this fearful unknown, it's the death, it's that knowledge of moving toward extinction, and it's also, I think, really key here, trying to imagine that alternative, that exit from the capitalist realism we are experiencing. Trying to imagine is a place to start, but we really need to make it happen if we're going to survive. And Matt kind of rightly asks, how might we not just think the fearful unknown, but embody it? How might we raise our consciousness, of death to the level of political action, wresting it from capitalist effects and subverting state capitalism's terrorizing power over us? So Fisher advocates for this too, this political action through communal consciousness raising and community building. We are more powerful together, and that really can help us resist that oppressive atomization of individuals by reminding us that we're not alone. And I think we can see some kind of hopeful, though problematic, examples of this in lots of recent green activism. For example, Extinction Rebellion, Change or Die, holding public funerals to mourn our planet, telling us that there is no alternative, but there's a question here around, do we change the system? Do we try and work within it to tweak it, or do we destroy it completely? I think there are lots of examples here that would be really good to try and explore a bit further and explore some of the problems of that way of thinking as well, and the effectiveness of that way of thinking in terms of activism in the breakout sessions. But what I do think here is that process of collective consciousness raising is beginning to happen, but we're not yet really seeing any real political alternatives because we still haven't managed to find that exit and to actually really imagine that a viable alternative to capitalism. And finally, I just want to end here on sort of taking a little bit of a step back and thinking about COVID-19 in particular and the lessons of capitalist realism, by taking a passage here from Slavoj Žižek's recent book, Pandemic. He manages to turn these books out so quickly, it's a wonder really, but he essentially says that universal threat gives birth to global solidarity. And also that it's quite a sad thought, but essentially it's like we need catastrophe in order to rethink the very basics of how we live. We need something to force us. So I'm interested to know if people think there is potential in the current moment to do something, and can we build momentum for change beyond this particular crisis and beyond this kind of like repetitive normalization of crisis? to actually mitigate some of the damage of climate catastrophe and maybe save ourselves from extinction. So I'm gonna sort of draw to a close here, and there are a few discussion points that I think might be useful for us in breakout sessions. And as Niall says, you know, I'm going to hand over to sort of Liam here and to others if there are any kind of questions or points to raise at this time. But I think the main sort of things that I kind of like to draw your attention to again here and can maybe be used as a springboard for discussion are these kind of three key ideas. One, that slow violence of capitalist realism and that tension between that kind of that long drawn out dying, that slow degradation of life and of well-being and of the planet, and that kind of strange jumping around, that normalisation of crisis, that distraction technique, to ask, is there anything about that process of the normalisation of crisis and what it's taught us that we can use to combat that longer, long-standing, slower form of violence and try and combat climate catastrophe? In terms of the mental health asteroid and embracing the fearful unknown, do you agree with that image? Do you think it's useful? Is it accurate of the mental health asteroid? You know, and also I think quite key here, what can our dealings with the mental health crises teach us about addressing the climate crisis? And finally, is there an alternative to capitalism, and is it possible? By thinking here a bit more about political action or inaction, so how best can we raise consciousness to the level of political action? So yeah, thank you all very much for listening. That's me pretty much finished there. So I'm going to hand over back to Niall and or Liam, I think.
Hi. It'd be great to kind of get Liam's input, I think, straight after that, and kind of, because you represent the Dystopias reading group, Liam, any kind of other relations to dystopia as well that you can draw on here. I know you recently did a piece of work where you kind of explained how you thought COVID-19 wasn't necessarily dystopia, or how we're not living in a dystopia. And I think maybe like you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, well, of course. Well, first of all, Josie, thank you for a really fascinating talk, and to the CTRG group for inviting me to come and, I don't know, prattle on for a bit. To go to what you were just saying there, Niall, about my recent thoughts about, are we living in a COVID-19 dystopia? There's a really important, I feel, piece of writing from Gregory Claeys in his recent work, Dystopia and Natural History. And it's a really long, really fascinating work on historical, sociological and literary dystopias. And certainly one key element that he picks out is that a dystopia is something that is caused by man, and not only caused by man, but perpetuated by man. So for instance, I would say like the climate crisis dystopia is, well, I'm not sure if it is quite a dystopia, in the sense that yes, it is our actions that have led to the climate crisis, but then I don't know if necessarily if we are actively, maliciously sort of perpetuating that. I think possibly in our inaction and our ineptitude, which I know is a word we've mentioned quite a bit recently now, that maybe in there is that perpetuation, but I think there's also an element of malicious intent within dystopias. There was the really, I sort of made quite a few notes as you were talking, Josie, so I apologise. Children of Men is a really fascinating film and a really fascinating novel as well. It's a P.D. James novel originally. And there's the mention of infertility and nothing new. And yet I would, sort of infertility, nothing new, no new people. But despite that, in the novel at least, I admit I haven't watched the film very recently. In the novel at least, women in particular who are missing sort of the potential to have children, they often parade dolls around in prams and buggies. And there's, I believe, an increasing sort of market in having increasingly lifelike children or lifelike dolls, increasingly more bespoke and, I don't know, fantastic prams and so on. So that was quite interesting because the world is ending, I guess, because, well, does the world end if there's no people to live in it? It's a philosophical question maybe. But certainly, capitalism is there continuing. And actually it was that Zizek / Jameson quotation I wanted to just challenge a little bit, maybe. And maybe it's a bit ambitious of me to try and challenge those two on my own. I was wondering if it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, because we have seen more recently in human history, we have seen events and crises that threaten the world more than they threaten capitalism. And I wonder if it's the fact that capitalism has become so embedded in our experience historically of the world that, yes, it is harder to imagine the end of it. However, being sort of, I don't know, reading books all the time, as I guess most of us do, I'm thinking about post-apocalyptic fiction as well. And actually, I would argue that post-apocalyptic fiction, so The Road, Station 11, even sort of in Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy, we see an end of a world, but I'd say actually we definitely more see the end of capitalism. We see the end of human society, but not the end of humanity. We see the end of human society, but not the actual end and complete destruction of the planet. Things are terrible, but not over. And so I'd sort of challenge the quotation slightly and wonder if it's actually easier to imagine an alternative world than it is to imagine an alternative to capitalism. Because I think in post-apocalyptic fiction in particular, we do see capitalism end because all those structures and hierarchies are completely demolished. You know, it's chaos, but it is still a world, and it is still, I guess, an alternative. It's just not one that we would particularly like. Yeah, and then just the idea of slow violence. I was just wondering if it's because we deal with history as very much as a historical phenomenon. We look back at history. I guess it's easier to look back at history and see significant change than it is for us to look at the incremental change of the day by day, the week by week, the year by year, unless it's 2020 and you can see that 2 months ago something bad was happening, 4 months ago the world wasn't quite ending. I'll end there. So thank you for allowing me to ramble.